Hello and welcome to our series of conversations with men and women whose ideas, vision and philosophy define our contemporary world. My guest today is one of India's most influential economists. He's held virtually every position of economic influence that's imaginable in India. He's been banking secretary, finance secretary, he was member secretary of the Planning Commission, and most recently for 6 years was governor of the Reserve Bank of India, and today is a member of the Upper House of Parliament in the Rajya Sabha. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Bimal Jalan.
Thank you very much. It's a very kind introduction.
You retired from, or moved on from the Reserve Bank. You were described as a political economist in the best sense of the term, with the emphasis on the political, I suppose, of the economist. Do you treat that as a compliment?
I think it's a compliment, yes. I mean, because we are working in a political system, trying to make economic policies.
What does it mean to be a political economist?
As you know, economics used to be political economy. I mean, in the earlier days, there was economics, politics, philosophy, as you know, in some of the graduate schools, to probably one of which you went to. And so it was allied, that you were obviously, and much of the economics you are doing, particularly macroeconomics, has a political dimension.
I think it's also alluding perhaps in some ways to the idea that economic decisions are also inevitably political ones. To what degree?
Not in the sort of negative sense. Ultimately, no representation or no taxation without representation, what does it mean? And when they're talking about any economic issue, ultimately the decisions which affect the people have to be made by the representatives of the people, and not by the economic theorists and so on. It is in that, what you might call, much larger, broader and higher sense that economics has an important political dimension.
And yet, for decades, much of political philosophy when the world, I guess, in some senses was less economically interdependent, did function in greater sort of political isolation in terms of ideological isolation, where it seemed that predetermined ideological framework tended to dictate economic policy.
Not really. If you look at it, if you think for a moment, the development economics that arose out of the colonial experience, which was political in a way. The pattern for India's economic development or for development economics was set by not the economists. We had great economists, who advised the political leadership. For example, our own planning process and so on, whatever its fault. Ultimately, the broad directions of policy was given by the political leadership and had a political experience.
I also meant in the sense that political ideologies in some senses tend to predetermine the way people look at economic decisions and economic judgments. I see what you're saying in the philosophical sense.
Yes, and there are two types of politics. One is what you might call populism, short-term political economic decisions which do the country harm. That's one. The second, which we are talking about at the moment, is in its higher dimension, that ultimately if economics affects people, then the ultimate decisions must be made at a political level.
I was looking at the role of the Reserve Bank, really. There is the perception, a sort of the great global figure managing an independent bank is Alan Greenspan, the Federal Reserve in the United States, and is often reported to be at odds with the government, or the government is fearful of what Alan Greenspan is going to do, and is seen as an independent entity almost. How real and true is that, say, for the governor of the Reserve Bank of India?
Let me speak about our relationship. What actually happens, the relationship between the government and the Reserve Bank of India, is that once the task has been assigned, in the sense price stability, in certain countries only price stability. For example, in Europe, ECB, that is the task of the ECB. In the federal legislation in the United States, it's employment and price stability. The Reserve Bank or a central bank is in charge of monetary policy. Now, the monetary instruments may differ. So once that task has been defined, some countries have inflation targeting, defined by parliament, defined by the political leadership. Then the action of when to move the interest rates up or down, that is decided by the central bank. In our country, the thing is a little more complex because we are talking about economic development, we're talking about external management, which is extremely important for us, and also the monetary management. So there has to be harmony, not only in the objectives, but also in the instruments of policy, because ultimately under our legislative framework, the accountability for Reserve Bank actions is that of the government. But I can tell you honestly that the two sides have worked very harmoniously, otherwise we would not be in as favorable, as positive a position today as we are.
But is there a potential risk that you may feel that it's important to further lower interest rates and pensioners might start screaming and that could have implications for the government in elections? Would it happen that someone may informally pick up the telephone and say, could you hold that for a few days?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, that can happen. And if there is always tension between different objectives, and I think you rightly pointed out that for a borrower, lower interest rates are good. For a saver, lower interest rates are not so good. So you have to balance the considerations, and I'm sure even in the United States, as you can see now, when you hear about about their Federal Reserve, they are interested in sustaining recovery because inflation is under control. So it also depends on time to time. That is, if inflation is the problem, then that's the primary task. If inflation is okay, but if economic recovery has to be boosted, that becomes the primary task. But in doing so, there are bound to be tensions between different classes of people. Some benefit from higher interest rates, some lose.
When you sort of hold as a position as powerful as that of the governor of the Reserve Bank, where sort of every expression on your face in response to a question is interpreted as a nuance, which could send people scurrying to buy foreign currency or sell it or the stock market or what have you, there's a great sense of power in that. How did sort of the humble you respond to the sense of enormous influence and power that?
No, not enormous influence and power, but responsibility. I mean, there are certain occupational hazards because they are guessing what you want, whether interest rates are going up, whether they're going to intervene in the market or not. So you have to be careful on what you say.
To what degree do you feel fettered or free that you're now in the Rajya Sabha? You're a member of Parliament. You've been appointed by the government. What has that shift done for you personally?
Great feeling of freedom, as it were. Professional freedom also. That one can talk more freely, one can write more freely, one can just decide on doing things which are of your own choice rather than you do things which have to be done because you are in a certain job. So I'm enjoying it enormously.
There has been, the finance minister has recently announced a series of measures.
I was wondering when I was going to ask that question.
The ethicality of it is being questioned. What is your view?
No, my view, honestly, is that that you have to judge any economic policy announcement in terms of the content and the effect, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. Now, if a good economic policy also happened to be good politics, there's nothing wrong with it to my mind. But if for good politics, you do something wrong, then obviously it's wrong. I'm not commenting on the set of decisions which have been announced by the Prime Minister. I'm making a general point. So the timing per se is not important as long as it is legal, as long as it is within the system, it is conventionally okay.
But what are some of these big issues that you might feel differently about than the agendas of the political process? You, Dr. Bimal Jalan, as an individual, you have been acting out what you say the political process has defined. What would be your political?
No, at the moment,
what would be your political framework? What would be the big issues?
You see, I think that so far as I would not take a party political view.
Sure.
I'm non-political in that sense. But I would like India to get where it has the potential of getting. And I also feel that the potential for India to be where it wants to be has never been greater. For 50 years, 56 we had the first balance of payments crisis. 1991 was the last bad one. 1997 was another difficult period. So we have lived through 50 years of this external constraint. That constraint is no longer there. That is for sure. And second, that this defeatist mentality of India is no longer there. So I think potential is there. We can do what we want to do. Now, if you ask me what is the most important thing to do today, I think is to improve our governmental delivery systems. That we say we will do it, but we can't, and we don't. I mean, it has become muddied. It has become, there's a lot of floss or whatever that word is, which is gathered around our systems, that we are not able to actually deliver. And therefore, I would like to concentrate on that area, reduce the procedural handicaps, the files moving around from everywhere to everywhere to everywhere, going nowhere. I've talked about it in Parliament also. So I think the first priority at the moment would be that, to clear the way, to clear the cobwebs, to clean the streets so that you and I can move.
How much of that can be achieved through legislative processes?
No, I would say that legislative processes, I mean, we should do less legislation that we do. You know, I mean, it's one of the fantastic things about India that every legislation that you see has a noble purpose, but it only adds to what exists. And one of the proposals that I will making is that whenever you introduce a piece of legislation, you must ask yourself, what does it replace? I mean, you have laws of 1868, 1840, 1922, 1928, 1970, 1990. If you look at the whole electricity power sector, I mean, that you have only added. We haven't replaced anything. If you look at the regulatory framework, I mean, you add on regulators, but you don't remove a ministry. So I think this we have to reduce rather than do more.
Dr. Jalan, with your permission, we'll take a short break and we'll be right back. Welcome back to my conversation with Dr. Bimal Jalan. The World Social Forum is holding forth in Bombay. Flags are being raised against globalization and many of the ills of this. Some of the world's best minds have focused on this. How do you view, many people describe as a jamboree, as a focused protest against the ills of globalization? Some look at them as well-motivated people who misunderstand what is unfolding. As someone who has welcomed globalization, not just as something that's in there sort of embracing the inevitable, but proactively, how do you react to what's happening?
No, I welcome the debate. We must be open, we must debate everything, because I think that is the only protection that you and I as people have. And it shows that part of India's strength is really this openness. So I welcome the social forum or whatever it is. But you must start by, so far as India is concerned, India is one of the least globalized countries in the world. If you look at India's share of trade, it's much less than anywhere else, except the peripheral developing countries. If you look at foreign, anything else, So, I mean, this is, so far as I am concerned, from this word, I would drop the word globalization because it has become controversial. Because people mean what they say they mean, which somebody else may not take it to be what it means. I mean, I'm sorry for this very complex sentence. What I mean is that all of us define globalization in our own way. I would say that so far as trade is concerned, so far as investment is concerned, so far as India's relationship with the rest of the world is concerned, today we are in a position to benefit more rather than less from freer access to their economies and their access to our economies. We are as competitive, as good, technologically, as efficient.
But I think that sort of the critics of globalization are arguing that it is really leaving behind, sort of the difference between India and Bharat is being left behind, and India is forging ahead. And many of the areas of social services, of education, of illiteracy, of public health, vast sections of India are simply being left behind. Do you see there an oversimplification of the...
No, I see an oversimplification that this is the effect of globalization. It is the effect of greater trade or greater openness. If Bharat was being left behind today, it was not as if Bharat was moving ahead at great speed 40 years ago. I mean, if you look at, so this is the wrong debate. So you should be focusing on that if we are not doing what we ought to be doing for our rural India or for our villages in terms of delivery of our services, then we ought to attack that part. But I don't see that is related in some way to what else is happening elsewhere in the economy, in IT firms or pharmaceuticals or somewhere else.
The perception is that it inhibits a nation's ability to act in its self-interest.
I mean, you inhibit that ability. What inhibits your ability to do what you want to do? I mean, I cannot see in the Indian context that if India today decided that my power plant load factor in some of these states, instead of being 40, would be 80. That somehow somebody would say, no, 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 this is against globalization. If India decided that your tube wells will not have the rate of failure of 70% of tube wells not working, that somebody would say that this is wrong. If India decided that your public investment or your roads or your rural roads should be built better and at a faster speed, that somebody would say it should not be done. What does it have to do with globalization? I do not understand.
But if India decided we don't want Coke, we don't want Pepsi, there would be an international furore about it.
That has nothing to do with that part. Ultimately India should decide what it wants to do. But what I'm saying is that that you cannot bring these issues down to that there is a conflict which is generated by globalization between Bharat and India. The conflict is generated by whatever we are doing. That if we are neglecting what we ought to be doing and doing what we should not be doing.
But that's an inevitable consequence of interdependent economies.
This is really not correct. If you look at Germany, in the welfare state times, did it have this share of trade which was much higher than what we do? You can call, if you look at the European, coalition, European Union, and they are completely integrated. Is it wrong for the poor of Europe? It's the policies, it's the delivery systems which matter more.
Do you, as a member of the Rajya Sabha, feel India is shining? Do you respond to that feeling?
No, I think this is, India is shining in parts of the country. But as I said to you, if the kind of contrast that you drew is right, and if the delivery systems are not working as efficiently as they should, if the power failure, if the water failure, if our roads, if the cleaning of our sewages, if the municipal services, if they are not so good, that India might be shining in one segment of India. But the rest of India requires to be done. But that shining India, it's not as if that shining India is preventing the rest of India from going ahead. This is the real issue. That don't distract attention from our own responsibility for delivering what we have told the people we would deliver.
What are some of the things you might do differently if you were autonomous in the sense there wasn't this political ideology or people deciding that this is what you need to deliver and achieve? What might you do differently? Would your objectives be the same as the mandate that you were given? Would you change that mandate as a voter, as a
No, I would. You see, I'm personally speaking. There is a lot of hypocrisy in the way we do our business. Every day you read about the MPs' perquisites. Everybody has huge perquisites but no salaries. For example, you have, you call yourself a government servant, but if you ask the public how much service it is getting from its servants, you'd get a reply which is extremely disturbing. We say this is PSU, public sector. Sounds tremendous, tremendously good. But what is happening is that you are taking public's money and financing some of the loss-making units. So, you just have to get over this problem. So I would like a little more truthfulness. If you are not public servants, let us call public lords. If we are not delivering what we have promised to deliver, let us say public extractors. What I'm saying is that much more genuineness is necessary.
I think one of your, your achievements at the Reserve Bank have been seen in two streams. One was sort of handling the series of crises, the Asian meltdown, the Kargil, American sanctions, etc., etc.
Don't remind me of those.
But it was also this process of taking governance close to the people, taking decision making, making it more transparent, and emphasis on institutions and processes. When we look at this debate of, is India shining, or parts of India shining and others are in darkness, I think most people's experience tends to be that, you have economic prosperity, but, the system stinks, you don't have access to quality, medical care if you're poor, there is corruption, there is a decay of values in the political culture and in the bureaucracy and what have you. Where does an economist look for solutions or interventions to these processes and these predicaments?
No, some of the stuff that are being discussed now, I mean, are trying to look at this predicament. For example, removing government from a large part of our lives. I mean, so the extent of corruption will decrease, has to decrease. If you don't have to run around finding this piece of paper,
the assumption there is that the market will somehow intervene to maintain social equity.
No, I'm just saying that just the ordinary business of, going around. Supposing you need a driving license, you need a registration, you need your PAN number, whatever you do. Yeah, I mean that you reduce that area where within the broad policy that I have to drive on the left, that's it, and I have to stop at the red light. That there is a whole system whereby I have freedom and I have rights, and I don't have to run around getting this permission, that permission from government authorities. That's where they think. This is part one. Part two is the whole disinvestment debate, labor reform debate. I mean, it concentrates on those sets of problems which are making India less efficient, less delivery-oriented economy than it should be.
If you were to identify, 5 or 6 or 2 or 3 sort of key interventions or key policies, not just in the economic realm, initiatives that you would like to see focused on in the next general elections, what might these be?
I think that the issues which are being discussed today are the right ones. I mean, whether India can have a rate of growth of 7%, 8%, whether India can reduce poverty, India can reduce inequality. Those issues, the big issues, are the ones that we are.
But these are issues that sort of happen in the Western, in the English language press and on elite channels and television. Why is it, I've often wondered, that the lack of roads, or whether a community health center works or an educational institution works or not, don't become sufficiently important issues when people are going to the ballot box?
No, that I think is, you are absolutely right in raising that particular problem, because there is, you see, something which affects everybody. Interestingly, in the public choice theory, it doesn't attract the same amount of attention. That's something which affects a section. I mean, the fact that all your public health centers are bad, that all your power stations don't deliver power, that all your public service institutions are not delivering, doesn't generate the same amount of excitement as if you are doing something which affects organized labor or organized industry or organized PSUs. It's a very interesting question. That everybody accepts that this is the way. India is a hot country in winter, and Delhi is a cold country in the cold. So, we don't worry about it.
But why is this so?
Acceptance. I mean, general acceptance.
But civilizational.
I don't know. No, I don't know. I mean, I think that we have done some things good, but I hope this issue would be raised. And as I think you rightly pointed out, that if every voter voted on whether the public health center or the water supply or the government services are good or bad in that district, and that's it. Whether they vote for the government in power or not in power, I think you would see some progress. I'm told that this has happened in the recent elections. I'm not sure whether it has or it hasn't, but it should happen.
You have, in some senses, for many years in your distinguished career, you've perhaps enjoyed less direct influence now than you ever had in the past. What do you look forward to?
No, I think there are different phases, and I think that the present role that I have, it may not be as operational as were some of the earlier positions that I have held, but I mean, it makes it more exciting because I have, some academic work to do. I mean, a certain amount of writing of some things that I have in mind, and Parliament, the kind of issues that I am raising with you, I would not have been able to raise, say, when I was operationally handling the same sort of jobs. So it is a different role, a different phase of one's career or one's life. So I'm quite happy.
Do you have a dream, a vision for 10 years from now for yourself?
Not for myself, no. For myself, I'll quietly fade away. But I mean, for India, I do. That it will be shining India.
Dr. Jalan, thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you.